The Carpathian Basin reveals that Jewish presence in the region predates the Hungarian conquest by several centuries, anchored primarily in the administrative and military structures of the Roman Empire. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the Roman province of Pannonia served as a frontier zone, where various ethnic groups from the Near East settled alongside the legions. Evidence for this early Jewish population is found in specific epigraphic remains and material culture unearthed in former Roman urban centers, like Intercisa, located near modern-day Dunaujvaros. One of the most significant finds is a stone tablet dedicated by Cosmius, a customs official and head of the synagogue at Intercisa, which confirms the existence of organized communal religious life during the reign of Septimius Severus. This artifact serves as a critical primary source, proving that Jewish individuals held official positions within the Roman fiscal apparatus and were integrated into the local bureaucracy. In addition to inscriptions, the presence of the menorah symbol on terracotta lamps and pottery fragments, discovered at sites such as Aquincum and Brigetio, provides further physical verification of Jewish identity in the province. These artifacts suggest that, while the community was part of the broader Roman Mediterranean diaspora, they maintained distinct ritual objects. Historical analysis of military diplomas also indicates that Jewish soldiers, often recruited from the Levant, were stationed along the Danubian limes to guard the empire's borders. Upon completing their service, many of these veterans were granted Roman citizenship and land, contributing to the permanent settlement of Jewish families in the Pannonian Plains. The movement of these individuals followed established trade routes that linked the Middle East to the Danubian provinces, facilitating the flow of both goods and people across the imperial interior. As the Roman administration began to withdraw from the region during the migration period, the Jewish presence entered a phase of fragmented documentation. However, the discovery of late Roman graves containing jewelry with Jewish motifs suggests a level of continuity even as the geopolitical landscape shifted. The transition from Roman provincial rule to the arrival of the Huns and subsequent Germanic tribes did not result in a total demographic vacuum, though the centralized records of the Roman state vanished. Fragmentary archaeological data from the 5th and 6th centuries indicate that small pockets of these earlier populations remained in the fortified remains of Roman castra. These early inhabitants laid a foundational layer of settlement that would eventually interface with the arrival of the Magyars and the Khazar-influenced groups in later centuries. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The survival of these early communities, however sparse the evidence, establishes the Carpathian Basin as a long-standing site of Jewish history, characterized by a transition from imperial integration to localized survival amidst the upheaval of the early Middle Ages. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? Following the establishment of the Hungarian state under the Arpad dynasty, the administrative focus shifted toward the modernization of the kingdom's fiscal and commercial infrastructure. This transition from a nomadic, plunder-based economy to a settled, sedentary state necessitated the involvement of groups with specialized knowledge in international trade and currency management. Unlike many contemporary Western European monarchs, the early Arpad kings, particularly Street Stephen and his immediate successors, viewed the Jewish community as essential agents of economic stability. Historical records from the 11th and 12th centuries indicate that Jewish merchants were specifically incentivized to settle in Hungary to facilitate the flow of goods between the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, and the emerging markets of the Holy Roman Empire. The legal framework of the early Hungarian kingdom provided a degree of autonomy that attracted Jewish families from both the Khazar Khaganate to the east and the German lands to the west. This migration was not merely incidental, but was part of a deliberate royal policy to stabilize the royal mint and oversee tax collection. Under King Koloman the Learned at the turn of the 12th century, legislation was enacted to regulate Jewish commercial activities, ensuring they operated under royal protection while contributing to the state treasury. These laws mandated that Jewish merchants conduct their transactions in specific urban centers, such as Esztergom and Székesfehérvár, which served as the primary nodes of the kingdom's financial network. By the mid-12th century, Jewish fiscal experts had become indispensable to the royal court, often serving as Kammerkämmerer or counts of the chamber. In this capacity, they were responsible for the leasing of royal revenues, including the management of salt monopolies, minting rights, and customs duties. The salt trade, in particular, was a vital component of the medieval Hungarian economy, and its efficient administration required the advanced bookkeeping and accounting methods provided by Jewish financiers. This systemic integration was solidified by the issuance of royal charters that guaranteed the safety of Jewish property and religious sites, effectively making the community a distinct legal entity, answerable directly to the crown, rather than to local feudal lords or church authorities. The interaction between the Arpad kings and the Jewish community was primarily defined by the concept of servi camerae regiae, or servants of the royal chamber. This status conferred a unique position within the feudal hierarchy, where the Jewish population was viewed as the personal property of the monarch. This arrangement ensured that the wealth generated by Jewish trade and banking was funneled directly into royal coffers, providing the liquidity necessary for the crown to fund military defenses and diplomatic missions. The presence of Hebrew inscriptions on 12th century Hungarian coins provides physical evidence of this fiscal partnership, marking a period where the Hungarian state's economic architecture was fundamentally intertwined with the expertise of its Jewish residents. This symbiotic relationship flourished under the principle that the prosperity of the Jewish community was inextricably linked to the strength and stability of the Hungarian throne. The issuance of the Golden Bull of 1222 by King Andrew II represented a foundational transformation in the constitutional history of the Hungarian kingdom, driven by an insurrection of the Servientes Regis and high-ranking barons. This document was the first formal legal instrument to curtail the absolute prerogative of the Arpad monarchs, specifically targeting the administrative and financial reforms known as the Nové institutions. Under these reforms, the crown had increasingly relied on non-noble specialists to manage state monopolies, a practice that the traditional landowning aristocracy perceived as a direct threat to their feudal privileges and economic dominance. The nobility's grievances focused on the perceived mismanagement of royal estates and the alienation of crown lands, which had diminished the traditional military and political influence of the Hungarian counts. Article 24 of the Golden Bull contained specific prohibitions that fundamentally altered the professional status of the Jewish community within the state hierarchy. This clause explicitly forbade Jewish individuals from holding the offices of Count of the Chamber, Mint Master, Salt Tax Collector, or any other public financial position. The enactment of this restriction was a response to the nobility's resentment toward the sophisticated credit systems and tax farming methods that Jewish administrators had implemented to modernize the royal treasury. By legally barring these experts from fiscal administration, the barons sought to reclaim control over the kingdom's most lucrative resources, particularly the salt trade and the regulation of the national currency. This legislative shift marked the end of the era where financial merit and royal loyalty were the sole criteria for high office, replacing it with a system predicated on noble birth and religious affiliation. The Golden Bull also addressed the issue of land ownership and the collection of tithes, areas where Jewish financiers had become increasingly active through the management of noble debts. The aristocracy viewed the growing influence of Jewish creditors as an encroachment upon the territorial integrity of their ancestral estates. Consequently, the document reinforced the church's jurisdiction over financial matters, further insulating the nobility from the rigorous accounting practices of the royal chamber. Despite these restrictive clauses, the immediate enforcement of Article 24 was inconsistent, as Andrew II remained dependent on the liquidity provided by Jewish tax farmers to fulfill his crusading debts and maintain the royal court. This tension between the formal written law and the practical requirements of statecraft created a volatile political environment where Jewish safety became a central point of negotiation between the king and the rebellious estates. The broader implications of 1222 extended to the diplomatic relations between the Hungarian crown and the Holy See. Pope Honorius III and later Gregory IX exerted significant pressure on the Arpad dynasty to uphold the restrictive clauses of the Golden Bull, viewing the exclusion of Jews from public office as a necessary step in aligning Hungary with the canonical decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council. This external religious pressure intersected with the internal aristocratic revolt, forcing the monarchy to repeatedly confirm the bull's provisions in subsequent decades. The legal precedent set in 1222 effectively transformed the Jewish community's status from protected architects of the economy to a contested group whose rights were subject to the shifting power dynamics between the king, the church, and the feudal nobility. This period established the legal framework for the exclusion and marginalization that would characterize the later medieval era. In the wake of the catastrophic Mongol invasion of 1241, King Bela IV initiated a comprehensive restructuring of the Hungarian state, a period historical scholarship often identifies as the second founding of the kingdom. The demographic and economic devastation required the immediate stabilization of the royal treasury and the repopulation of urban centers. Recognizing that the restrictive spirit of the 1222 Golden Bull had proven detrimental to the state's fiscal liquidity, Bela IV moved to reintegrate Jewish economic actors under a new, robust legal framework. The pivotal Charter of 1251 served as the definitive statutory code for the Jewish community, effectively nullifying the more extreme prohibitions of previous decades and establishing a model of legal protection that would persist for over a century. This document was heavily influenced by the Austrian Privilegium Fridericianum of 1244, reflecting a broader Central European trend toward codifying the status of Jewish populations as direct assets of the sovereign. The central pillar of the 1251 Charter was the formal definition of Jews as servi camerae regiae, or servants of the royal chamber. This legal fiction established that the Jewish community was not subject to the jurisdiction of the county nobility or the local judiciary, but was the exclusive property of the monarch. This direct dependency provided a crucial layer of security, as any injury to a Jewish person or their property was prosecuted as a direct affront to the royal person, punishable by heavy fines payable to the crown. The charter detailed specific judicial procedures, mandating that legal disputes involving Jews and Christians be tried before a royal judge or the master of the treasury. This centralized judicial oversight ensured that the community could operate their financial and commercial enterprises without the interference of local feudal lords who often sought to avoid debt obligations through discriminatory local rulings. Economic clauses in the charter specifically protected the right of the Jewish community to engage in lending and the pawnbroking of various commodities, including uncoined silver and clothing, provided these items were not blood-stained or sacred ecclesiastical objects. The regulation of interest rates was codified to prevent excessive volatility, while simultaneously ensuring that Jewish creditors had legal recourse to recover their principal from defaulting noble debtors. Furthermore, the charter protected religious institutions, explicitly forbidding the desecration of synagogues or cemeteries, and guaranteeing the right of Jews to move freely throughout the kingdom for the purposes of trade. These protections were instrumental in restoring Hungary's internal trade routes and providing the crown with the necessary credit to fund the construction of the stone castle network intended to repel future invasions. The long-term impact of the 1251 Charter was the creation of a stable, albeit segregated, urban environment where Jewish quarters became permanent fixtures in cities like Buda, Sopron, and Pressburg. By defining the Jewish community's status through a royal grant of privileges, Bela IV created a fiscal buffer against the rising power of the landed aristocracy. This legal arrangement transformed the Jewish population into a specialized administrative class whose survival was tied to the strength of the centralized monarchy. The charter remained the primary legal reference point for Jewish life in Hungary until the mid-14th century, providing a level of predictability in social and economic relations that allowed Jewish families to invest deeply in the kingdom's infrastructure. This era of relative stability, however, remained fundamentally precarious, as it rested entirely on the crown's ability to defend its servants against the competing interests of the church and the nobility. The urbanization of medieval Hungary during the late 13th and early 14th centuries facilitated a complex social architecture where Jewish quarters, or Judenvikas, functioned as integral components of the city's topographic and economic profile. In Buda, which had emerged as the kingdom's administrative center following the Mongol retreat, the Jewish community was situated primarily along the western slopes of the Castle Hill. Archaeological excavations in this district have uncovered a high density of stone-built residences, featuring vaulted cellars designed for the secure storage of liquid assets and commercial inventory. This physical proximity to the royal palace was a strategic necessity, reinforcing the direct legal link between the crown and its financial administrators. The street layout of the Buda Jewish quarter was characterized by narrow, paved thoroughfares that allowed for efficient movement between the market stalls and the religious core of the neighborhood. Esztergom, as the ecclesiastical capital, presented a different model of coexistence, where the Jewish community resided in the Civitas Archiepiscopalis under the shadow of the cathedral. Despite the official canon law restrictions discussed in ecclesiastical circles, the Jewish quarter in Esztergom was a hub of regional trade, specializing in the wholesale of precious metals and high-quality textiles. Daily life was governed by the rhythms of the medieval marketplace, where Jewish traders interacted with German burghers and Magyar craftsmen in the shared spaces of the forum. These interactions were regulated by the Judex Judaeorum, a Christian official appointed to oversee transactions and ensure that the various ethnic groups adhered to the royal trade monopolies. Material culture from these sites, including bone-carved scales and ceramic weights, indicates a standardized system of measurement that facilitated cross-cultural commercial exchange. The social fabric of these quarters was anchored by the synagogue, which functioned not only as a liturgical space, but as a communal administrative hall. In Buda, the remains of the early Gothic synagogue suggest a structure of significant architectural sophistication, featuring rib-vaulted ceilings and decorative elements that mirrored the prevailing urban aesthetic of Central Europe. Adjacent to these religious structures were the ritual baths, or mikvaot, which required complex water management systems to ensure a constant supply of fresh water from the Danube or local cisterns. These facilities provide archaeological evidence of a highly organized communal life that prioritized sanitation and ritual purity, even within the crowded confines of a medieval fortified city. The presence of specialized butchers and bakers within the quarter further highlights the internal self-sufficiency of the community in matters of dietary law. Domestic life in these urban centers was characterized by a synthesis of traditional Jewish customs and the broader material environment of medieval Hungary. Household inventories recorded in contemporary legal documents show that Jewish families utilized locally manufactured Majolica pottery and Central European metalware, alongside ritual items such as bronze Hanukkah lamps. The educational landscape was equally robust, with primary schools and study halls serving as centers for the transmission of Hebrew literacy and rabbinic law. This intellectual infrastructure allowed the community to maintain connections with the wider Ashkenazi diaspora while remaining firmly embedded in the local urban economy. The relative stability of this period allowed for a flourishing of communal institutions that, while physically segregated by walls or gates, remained functionally indispensable to the broader cosmopolitan life of the Hungarian royal seats. The extinction of the Arpad dynasty in 1301 precipitated a period of profound political fragmentation, eventually resolved by the triumph of the Neapolitan Angevin branch under Charles Robert. His consolidation of power required the systematic dismantling of the oligarchic system, where local provincial lords had usurped royal prerogatives, including the right to mint coins and collect taxes. To restore the central authority of the crown, Charles Robert initiated a series of radical fiscal reforms that replaced traditional feudal levies with a more predictable system of state revenue. Central to this strategy was the introduction of the lucrum camera, a direct tax levied on households, which provided the liquid capital necessary to maintain a professional mercenary army and bypass the unreliable military summons of the high nobility. The reform of the Hungarian mining sector became the primary engine of Angevin statecraft, as Charles Robert exploited the kingdom's vast deposits of gold and silver. By decreeing that 1/3 of the royal mining tax remain with the landowner, he incentivized the aristocracy to open new mines, while simultaneously mandating that all raw precious metals be exchanged for royal currency at state-controlled mints. This monopoly on the moneta aurea, or gold florin, modeled after the stable currency of Florence, transformed Hungary into a dominant European financial power. The administrative oversight of these complex mining and minting operations relied heavily on a specialized bureaucracy of financial experts. During this era of centralization, the Jewish community's role evolved, as the king sought to insulate the royal treasury from the influence of the great barons, utilizing Jewish financiers as indispensable intermediaries in the management of these new, large-scale revenues. Diplomatically, the Angevin reign was characterized by a shift toward regional integration, most notably through the Congress of Visegrad in 1335. This summit established a commercial alliance between Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, designed to bypass the trade staples of Vienna and facilitate the direct movement of goods across Central Europe. The resulting economic boom saw an influx of Italian and Jewish merchants who managed the sophisticated credit networks required for such high-volume international trade. Charles Robert's administration utilized these commercial connections to fund the luxury of the royal court at Visegrad, which became a model of Mediterranean-influenced chivalry and administrative order. This period of political stability was predicated on a delicate equilibrium, where the monarch's absolute control over the treasury allowed him to dominate the feudal estates through patronage rather than coercion. The transition to the reign of Louis I, later known as Louis the Great, in 1342, inherited this centralized apparatus, but applied it toward more expansive territorial and religious objectives. While Charles Robert had focused on domestic financial stability, Louis I pursued a policy of dynastic aggrandizement that saw Hungary intervene heavily in the affairs of Naples and the Balkan principalities. This outward expansion required even greater financial mobilization, reinforcing the crown's dependence on the urban merchant class and Jewish tax farmers to liquidate royal assets for military campaigns. The political landscape under the early Angevins thus represented a move toward a proto-modern state, where the king's power was no longer derived solely from land ownership but from the effective control of precious metal production and the sophisticated management of international capital. This concentration of financial resources in the hands of the sovereign laid the groundwork for the later religious and social tensions that would define the mid-14th century. The reign of Louis I, spanning from 1342 to 1382, marked a departure from the purely fiscal pragmatism of his predecessor, as the king sought to align the Hungarian monarchy with the rigorous ideological standards of the High Middle Ages. Educated in a court deeply influenced by French and Italian chivalric traditions, Louis envisioned his role as that of the athlete of Christ, a sovereign whose legitimacy was derived from military prowess in the service of the Roman Catholic Church. This worldview necessitated a more militant approach to governance, where the administrative machinery of the state was increasingly directed toward religious conformity and the expansion of Catholic influence in the Balkans. Unlike previous monarchs who tolerated religious plurality for economic gain, Louis's administration was defined by an unprecedented degree of intersection between secular law and ecclesiastical doctrine. Louis's personal piety translated into a state policy that prioritized the moral and religious uniformity of his subjects. In 1351, he issued a landmark decree that reinforced the Aviticitatis law, a measure designed to prevent the fragmentation of noble estates by ensuring they remained within the male line of the family. While this was a feudal regulation, its primary purpose was to strengthen the hereditary basis of the Natio Hungarica, creating a stable class of Christian knights who were bound to the crown through both land ownership and religious duty. This centralization of noble identity was accompanied by an intensified alliance with the papacy, as Louis campaigned extensively to suppress the Bogomil heresy in Bosnia and to re-establish Catholic hegemony in the Venetian-held territories of the Dalmatian coast. These military expeditions were framed not merely as territorial acquisitions, but as holy wars, establishing the king as the primary defender of the faith in Central Europe. The institutionalization of religious fervor had a profound impact on the legal standing of non-Christian groups within the kingdom. During this period, the influence of the mendicant orders, particularly the Franciscans and Dominicans, reached its zenith at the royal court, providing the king with a theological justification for a more exclusionary social policy. Louis became increasingly convinced that the continued prosperity of the Hungarian state was contingent upon its spiritual purity, a conviction that led to a gradual tightening of the civil liberties previously afforded to religious minorities. This ideological shift was reflected in the king's efforts to promote the conversion of his subjects, as he viewed the existence of non-believing communities as a source of divine disfavor. The fiscal administration, once a neutral ground of meritocratic cooperation, began to be viewed through a lens of moral scrutiny, where the presence of Jewish financiers was increasingly contested by the king's clerical advisors. By the late 1342, Louis's commitment to the ideal of the Christian knight led to a reorganization of the royal entourage, where chivalric orders and religious confraternities played a central role in the formulation of state policy. This militarized spirituality provided the impetus for Louis's intervention in the Neapolitan succession, an expensive and prolonged series of campaigns that drained the royal treasury and required the continuous liquidation of crown assets. The king's insistence on the moral superiority of his cause meant that fiscal necessity often collided with religious zeal, creating a volatile domestic situation where the crown struggled to balance its expansive crusading ambitions with the economic requirements of a stable kingdom. The reign of Louis the Great thus transformed Hungary into a bastion of medieval Christendom. But this rigid ideological commitment simultaneously eroded the pragmatic cosmopolitanism that had defined the kingdom's early success. The middle of the 14th century witnessed a significant maturation of the Hungarian internal and export markets, shifting the focus of high-level commerce from purely financial services toward the large-scale brokerage of agricultural commodities. Jewish merchants, leveraging established networks that connected the Carpathian Basin to the markets of the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish Kingdom, became the primary intermediaries in the distribution of Hungarian grain and wine. The surplus produced on the vast manorial estates of the nobility required efficient transport and sophisticated credit arrangements to reach distant urban consumers, functions that Jewish traders fulfilled with increasing technical proficiency. This specialized role in the wholesale market ensured a consistent flow of capital through the kingdom, providing the Angevin crown with a reliable source of liquid wealth derived from transaction fees and transit duties. The wine trade, specifically from the vineyards of the Sopron region and the northern foothills, evolved into a cornerstone of the royal export economy during this period. Jewish entrepreneurs often managed the entire supply chain, from providing credit to vintners for equipment and labor, to the physical transport of the product to the trade hubs of Bratislava and Krakow. This high-volume trade was essential for the state, as it fueled the tricesima, or the 30th tax, which was the primary customs levy collected at the kingdom's borders. The efficiency of these Jewish-led trade syndicates provided the monarchy with a financial buffer, allowing the crown to maintain its administrative independence from the landed nobility. By facilitating the export of wine, Jewish merchants essentially acted as the commercial diplomats of the Hungarian state, opening new avenues for capital influx. Simultaneously, the royal free cities were experiencing the rapid rise of a self-conscious burgher class, predominantly composed of German settlers and local Magyar artisans organized into increasingly powerful guilds. These urban citizens sought to establish total monopolies over the local retail markets and the transit of goods through their jurisdictions. The success of Jewish merchants in the wholesale grain and wine trades was increasingly perceived as a direct encroachment upon the traditional staple rights and market privileges of the burgher councils. Resentment grew as the burghers realized that Jewish traders, protected by royal decree and answerable only to the king, could bypass the restrictive guild regulations that governed the rest of the urban population. This economic competition was further exacerbated by the burghers' desire to control the lucrative credit markets within their own city walls. Municipal authorities began to implement localized anti-competitive measures designed to marginalize Jewish commercial activity in favor of the Christian burgher elite. These included bans on Jewish merchants participating in certain retail trades, restrictions on the purchase of properties in central marketplaces, and the imposition of separate tolls for the entry of Jewish-owned caravans. While the crown officially discouraged these local infringements on its servants, the political influence of the royal free cities made it difficult for the monarchy to fully suppress the burghers' protectionist efforts. The tension was not merely religious but fundamentally structural, representing a clash between the centralized, royal protected commerce of the Jewish community and the emerging corporate power of the urban municipalities. By the late 1340s, this systemic friction had transformed the urban landscape into a site of constant legal and economic contestation. The burgeoning burgher class increasingly utilized religious rhetoric and appeals to social order to mask their primary objective of eliminating Jewish competition from the most profitable sectors of the agricultural trade. This shift signaled the beginning of a breakdown in the urban synthesis that had characterized the previous century, as the pragmatic necessity of Jewish fiscal expertise was overshadowed by the burghers' pursuit of total commercial hegemony. The prosperity once generated by cross-cultural cooperation was now a source of deep-seated communal division, leaving the Jewish community increasingly isolated as the economic landscape of the kingdom grew more competitive and less tolerant of those operating outside the municipal guild structures. The fundamental paradox of the medieval Hungarian legal system was that the Jewish community's highest level of security, their direct subordination to the crown, was also their most significant structural vulnerability. In the mid-14th century, the concept of royal protection was not an institutionalized civil right, but a personal, revocable contract between the sovereign and his servants of the chamber. While earlier charters had provided a facade of continuity, the legal reality under Louis I was that the monarch possessed plenum dominium over the Jewish population, meaning their lives, property, and residency rights were entirely dependent on the king's discretionary power. This meant that the protections codified in the previous century could be invalidated by a single royal signature, as there were no constitutional checks or independent judiciaries capable of challenging a monarch's decree. The administrative mechanism of this protection was managed through the office of the treasurer, or the tavernicus, but this official functioned solely as an executive arm of the royal will, rather than an impartial mediator. If the king's personal ideology or political priorities shifted, the treasurer was obligated to enforce the new mandate, regardless of prior precedents or established commercial agreements. This institutional vacuum meant that the Jewish community lacked any form of corporate standing comparable to the guilds or the ecclesiastical orders, which possessed their own courts and internal statutes. Without a secondary legal recourse, the Jewish population found that their safety was inextricably tied to their immediate utility to the sovereign's current agenda. By the late 1340s, a critical shift occurred in how the crown viewed the value of its Jewish assets. Historically, the monarchy protected Jewish financiers because their expertise in credit and currency was essential for state liquidity. However, as the Angevin administrative state became more established and royal revenues from gold mining reached their peak, the pragmatic necessity of Jewish fiscal management began to diminish. The king now possessed the luxury of choosing ideological purity over financial expediency. When the fiscal benefits provided by the Jewish community were weighed against the political advantages of satisfying a religiously fervent nobility and a protectionist burgher class, the sovereign's whim moved toward the latter. The royal fisc was now sufficiently robust that the crown could consider the total liquidation of Jewish assets as a viable alternative to their continued protection. Furthermore, the legal status of servi camerae regiae evolved from a protective shield into a mechanism for extraction. Because the Jewish community was legally considered an extension of the royal treasury, the king could treat their accumulated wealth as a reserve to be utilized at his convenience. This absolute ownership meant that the king could cancel debts owed by Christian nobles to Jewish creditors as a form of political patronage, effectively stripping the Jewish community of their capital without any legal avenue for appeal. The fragility of this arrangement became apparent when the crown began to prioritize its own long-term political consolidation over the short-term transactional benefits of the Jewish-monarch partnership. This systemic instability was compounded by the absence of a territorial base or feudal standing for the Jewish community. Unlike the barons who could retreat to fortified estates, or the clergy who could appeal to Rome, the Jewish residents of Buda and other royal seats were physically and legally confined to spaces controlled by the king. The realization of this vulnerability grew as Louis I's court became increasingly influenced by clerical advisors who argued that the sovereign's duty to God superseded his contractual obligations to non-Christian subjects. By 1349, the legal architecture that had once seemed to guarantee a permanent place for the Jewish community in Hungary was revealed to be a temporary arrangement of royal convenience, susceptible to the rising tide of pandemic-induced panic and religious radicalization. The socio-political environment of Western Europe in the decades preceding 1349 was characterized by an intensifying hostility toward Jewish communities, transitioning from localized communal friction to systematic state-sponsored persecution. This shift was precipitated by the breakdown of the medieval social order in the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France, where the traditional protections afforded by monarchs were increasingly undermined by popular religious movements and economic instability. The expulsion of the Jewish population from France in 1306 by Philip IV, followed by subsequent readmissions and secondary expulsions in 1322, established a significant precedent for the total liquidation of Jewish assets to resolve royal insolvency. These events demonstrated to contemporary European observers that the legal status of the Jewish community was no longer a fixed element of the social hierarchy, but a negotiable commodity subject to the immediate fiscal and ideological needs of the sovereign. During the 1,332, the Rhineland and Franconia witnessed the rise of the Armleader massacres, a series of violent outbreaks led by peasant militias who targeted Jewish residents in various urban centers. These attacks were fueled by a volatile combination of agrarian debt and the radicalization of the lower clergy, who increasingly utilized the rhetoric of blood libel and host desecration to incite communal violence. The administrative failure of the German princes to suppress these uprisings revealed the growing disconnect between the theoretical legal protections of the Servitudo Camerae and the practical reality of rural and urban lawlessness. This period saw the emergence of the flagellant movement, or the Geisler, whose public displays of penance were inextricably linked to a militant anti-Jewish agenda, as they traveled between cities, spreading apocalyptic warnings that implicated Jewish communities in the perceived moral decay of Christendom. In the Iberian Peninsula, the Shepherd's Crusade of 1320, or the Pasturo, further illustrated the capacity of decentralized, populist movements to bypass royal authority and initiate mass violence against Jewish quarters. Although the Crown of Aragon attempted to maintain its traditional role as a protector, the scale of the uprising forced a reassessment of the political cost of defending non-Christian subjects. These trans-European movements established a shared ideological framework that linked Jewish presence to social and religious crisis, creating a cultural climate where the physical elimination of Jewish communities was increasingly viewed as a necessary step toward communal purification. The legal innovations introduced during this period in various European jurisdictions aimed at further restricting Jewish land ownership and commercial mobility, effectively creating a demographic of internal exiles, whose residency was permanently precarious. The institutional response of the Church during the mid-14th century was equally complex, as papal bulls condemning violence were frequently ignored by local bishops and mendicant friars, who prioritized the total Christianization of the urban space. The Council of the Viennese Synod had already reinforced the requirement for Jews to wear distinguishing marks on their clothing, a visual marker of their marginalized status that served to facilitate their isolation during times of social unrest. This legislative environment ensured that the Jewish community remained a visible and distinct target, even as they became more economically integrated into the burgeoning commodity markets. The intellectual elite of the era began to codify anti-Jewish sentiment into theological and legal treatises, providing a veneer of scholarly legitimacy to popular prejudices. By the dawn of the 1342, the cumulative impact of these Western European developments created an ominous paradigm for the Hungarian monarchy. The news of massacres in the Rhineland and the expulsions from French territories reached the court in Buda through established diplomatic channels and the reports of traveling merchants. This flow of information established a psychological link between the stability of the kingdom and the perceived Jewish problem, as defined by Western European neighbors. The gathering storm was not merely a series of isolated incidents, but a cohesive shift in the European consciousness that prioritized religious uniformity over the pragmatic cosmopolitanism of the previous century. This external pressure provided the ideological template that would be activated in Hungary, once the environmental catastrophe of the Black Death provided the necessary catalyst for total social upheaval. The environmental catalyst for the mid-14th century pandemic resided in the bacterium Yersinia pestis, an organism indigenous to the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppes and the Tibetan Plateau. Biological research indicates that the pathogen primarily circulated among marmots and ground squirrels, maintained within these subterranean colonies through a specialized flea vector, Xenopsilla chiapis. A significant shift in global climate patterns during the early 1330 seconds, characterized by prolonged droughts followed by heavy precipitation, disrupted these natural habitats, forcing infected rodent populations to migrate toward human agricultural settlements in search of food. This ecological displacement facilitated the first instances of spillover, where the bacteria transitioned from wild rodents to the Rattus rattus, or the black rat, which thrived in the grain-heavy environments of the Silk Road's sedentary outposts. The rapid transmission of the pathogen across Eurasia was inadvertently accelerated by the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative political stability that had integrated the transcontinental trade routes under the centralized control of the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate. As merchant caravans moved westward from the Mongol capital of Sarai, they served as biological conduits for the bacteria, transporting infected fleas within bundles of fur, silk, and grain. By 1346, the plague had reached the shores of the Black Sea, specifically the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. Historical records indicate that during the siege of Kaffa, the Mongol forces under Khan Janabeg suffered high mortality rates from the disease and utilized the bodies of the deceased as biological projectiles, catapulting them over the city's defensive walls. This specific event is credited with introducing the pathogen to the Genoese merchant elite stationed within the fortress. The biological mechanisms of the plague manifested in three primary forms, with the bubonic variant being the most prevalent during the initial European landing. Once the bacteria entered the human lymphatic system through a flea bite, it caused the painful swelling of lymph nodes, known as buboes, typically in the groin or axilla. The pneumonic variant, which facilitated person-to-person transmission through respiratory droplets, and the septicemic variant, which attacked the bloodstream directly, ensured a high mortality rate even among populations not directly exposed to infected rodents. The vulnerability of the European population was further compounded by the Great Famine of 1315, 1317, and the onset of the Little Ice Age, which had resulted in chronic malnutrition and weakened immune systems across all social strata. In late 1347, 12 Genoese galleys fleeing the siege of Kaffa arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina, marking the official entry of the pandemic into the Mediterranean basin. Port authorities noted that the crews arrived either deceased or in states of extreme physical distress, bearing the characteristic necrotic symptoms of the infection. Despite immediate attempts to quarantine the vessels, the pathogen quickly infiltrated the urban rat populations, initiating an exponential spread through the Italian peninsula. By early 1348, the plague had reached the commercial hubs of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, moving inland along the established riverine and terrestrial trade paths. The speed of the pandemic's progression was unprecedented, often outstripping the flow of news regarding its nature. The biological march toward the Hungarian frontier was facilitated by the intense commercial ties between the Angevin court and the Italian city-states. As the plague decimated the urban centers of the Adriatic coast, it moved northward into the Holy Roman Empire and the Balkan interior. The administrative state of Louis I, though centralized, possessed no medical or scientific framework to address a microscopic threat of this magnitude. The reliance on traditional humoral medicine and theological explanations left the kingdom's population scientifically defenseless, as the environmental conditions of the late 1340 seconds created an ideal ecosystem for the bacteria to flourish. This biological arrival set the stage for a total systemic collapse, where the established social and legal orders were overwhelmed by a mortality event that defied contemporary human understanding. The geographical positioning of the Hungarian kingdom served as a primary nexus for the pandemic's inland progression during the spring of 1348, as the infection moved beyond the Mediterranean littoral. Unlike the rapid maritime spread characterized by the coastal ports, Hungary's encounter with the pathogen was facilitated by the terrestrial and riverine arteries that linked the Angevin court to the commercial hubs of Central Europe. The Amber Road, an ancient trade route connecting the Adriatic port of Ragusa to the Baltic Sea, functioned as a critical biological conduit, transporting the bacteria through the heavily trafficked mountain passes of the Carpathians. Historical records from the municipal archives of Sopron and Pressburg indicate that the first documented mortalities occurred among the merchant caravans arriving from the Austrian lands and the Venetian-held Dalmatian coast, marking the collapse of the kingdom's peripheral biological defenses. By the summer of 1348, the plague had infiltrated the Danubian trade network, utilizing the high-volume transport of bulk grain and textiles as a medium for the infected flea vectors. The urban centers of Upper Hungary, particularly the mining towns such as Selmecbánya and Kermekbánya, experienced an immediate cessation of industrial activity as the infection decimated the specialized workforce. This disruption was not merely a loss of labor, but a total paralysis of the royal minting process, as the refined silver and gold required for the Angevin currency could no longer be produced or transported safely to the central administrative hubs. The lucrum camera, the primary direct tax of the crown, became impossible to collect, as the royal tax farmers either succumbed to the disease or fled the urban parishes, leaving the state's fiscal records in a condition of unprecedented disarray. The administrative rhythms of the medieval Hungarian state, which relied on the seasonal movement of the royal court and the functioning of the county courts, were effectively suspended by the late autumn of 1348. Judicial proceedings, overseen by the Master of the Treasury, were halted as the Palatinus and other high-ranking officials initiated a policy of social distancing, retreating to isolated stone fortresses. This vacuum of local authority led to the immediate breakdown of the guild structures in Buda and Esztergom, where the traditional apprenticeships and market regulations were abandoned in favor of basic survival. The liturgical life of the kingdom, which provided the temporal framework for the medieval population, was similarly disrupted. The high mortality rate among the urban clergy meant that the daily offices and the administration of the last rites often went unperformed, fueling a sense of spiritual abandonment that surpassed previous social crises. The economic repercussions of the initial 1348 wave were felt most acutely in the agricultural sector, where the spillover of the bacteria into the rural rat populations initiated a secondary cycle of infection. As the harvest season approached, the sudden reduction in available manorial labor resulted in the rotting of crops in the field, leading to immediate localized famines that compounded the biological lethality of the plague. The wine trade, which had previously integrated Hungary into the European commodity market, collapsed as the transport networks were severed to prevent the movement of the corrupted air. This commercial isolation had a profound impact on the Jewish merchant class, whose specialized role in the international brokerage of these goods made them highly visible during the onset of the economic stagnation. As 1348 drew to a close, the Hungarian kingdom was transformed from a burgeoning European power into a collection of isolated, besieged communities. The centralized state established by Charles Robert and Louis I proved structurally incapable of responding to an invisible, non-military threat that operated independently of feudal hierarchies. The biological reality of the pandemic had effectively dismantled the cosmopolitan synthesis of the previous decades, replacing the collaborative urban environment with a landscape defined by mortality and the total disruption of traditional legal and social obligations. This initial outbreak established the logistical and psychological conditions that would eventually focus the kingdom's collective desperation on its internal minorities as the traditional explanations for social order were proven insufficient in the face of the encroaching mortality. The persistence of high mortality rates throughout the late 1340s induced a profound state of social anomie within the Hungarian kingdom, as the foundational pillars of medieval communal life proved incapable of mitigating the crisis. This period was defined by the total failure of Galenic medical theory, which relied on the balance of the four humors and the concept of miasma to explain disease. When the traditional remedies of bloodletting, herbal aromatic barriers, and dietary adjustments failed to alter the course of the infection, the intellectual authority of the university-trained physicians collapsed. This vacuum of empirical understanding was immediately filled by a pervasive psychological trauma, as the population realized that the physical body was no longer protected by any earthly science. The inability to stop the spread of the disease led to a fragmentation of the domestic unit, with contemporary observers noting that the natural obligations of kinship were often abandoned. The fear of contagion became so acute that parents frequently deserted infected children, and spouses fled from one another to avoid the necrotic symptoms. The spiritual crisis was equally acute, as the Roman Catholic Church, the primary arbitrator of the medieval worldview, suffered a catastrophic loss of prestige. The doctrine of the ars moriendi, or the art of dying well, required the presence of a priest to administer the last rites and facilitate the soul's transition to the afterlife. However, the extreme lethality of the pathogen among the clergy, who were frequently exposed to the dying in their line of duty, led to a severe shortage of ordained ministers. When the sacraments became unavailable, the population experienced a form of collective eschatological panic, believing that they were being denied entry into heaven. The failure of the clergy to intercede with the divine through prayer and penance suggested to many that the institutional church had lost its mandate, leading to a surge in unmediated radical religious movements that operated outside the traditional hierarchy. This social breakdown manifested in the rejection of traditional burial customs, which were essential for maintaining the dignity of the deceased and the comfort of the survivors. The transition from individual, consecrated graves to mass burial pits, or plague trenches, symbolized the dehumanization of the population under the weight of the pandemic. The psychological impact of seeing the dead, handled as common refuse, eroded the medieval concept of the sacredness of the human form. In response to this perceived abandonment by both God and the state, the population turned toward apocalyptic interpretations of the disaster. The belief that the Black Death was the great mortality preceding the Last Judgment became the dominant psychological framework, leading to a state of hypervigilance and a desperate search for the hidden sins that had provoked divine wrath. The behavioral response to this communal terror divided into two extremes: a total abandonment of moral restraint and an obsessive, militant asceticism. Some urban populations in Buda and the royal seats engaged in hedonistic excess, operating under the assumption that life was fleeting and traditional laws no longer held authority. Conversely, others sought to appease the divine through public displays of self-mortification, although these movements were often viewed with suspicion by the Angevin court. The collective psyche of the kingdom was thus characterized by a deep-seated instability, where the previous decade's confidence in royal order and religious stability was replaced by a localized, frantic search for a visible cause of the invisible slaughter. This erosion of social trust created the necessary psychological conditions for the population to seek a tangible enemy who could be held responsible for the corruption of the heir and the subsequent failure of the kingdom's traditional defenses. The transition from generalized terror to directed communal hostility was facilitated by the medieval requirement for a causal agent that aligned with a tangible human-centric logic. As the biological mechanisms of the plague remained obscured by the limitations of 14th-century science, the Hungarian urban populace sought a visible cause to explain the uneven distribution of mortality. The primary accusation that emerged was the well-poisoning conspiracy, a narrative that suggested the Jewish community had systematically contaminated urban water supplies with lethal powders. This specific charge provided a prosecutable offense for a catastrophe that otherwise seemed beyond the reach of human justice, effectively shifting the pandemic from an intangible environmental event into a malicious act of sabotage. The physical structure of the Jewish quarters, in cities such as Buda and Sopron, while once a mark of royal status, now served as a focus for localized suspicion. Because Jewish communities maintained their own ritual baths and often drew water from private cisterns for religious purification, their perceived avoidance of public wells was misinterpreted by the Christian majority as proof of criminal intent. In several instances, the lower mortality rates observed within specific Jewish households, frequently a result of religious dietary laws and frequent ritual washing, were cited by urban agitators as empirical evidence of their immunity to a poison they had allegedly manufactured. This distortion of objective observation served to mobilize the burgher class, who utilized the atmosphere of mass death to bypass the royal judicial oversight that had historically shielded these communities. The search for a scapegoat was further propelled by the total suspension of the royal peace, as the king's administrative officials remained in isolation. In this vacuum of authority, local municipal councils often acted as independent judiciaries, authorizing investigations that involved the systematic use of torture to extract confessions of well poisoning. These documented confessions, though obtained through duress, were circulated among the Hungarian free cities as factual proof of a coordinated plot. The rhetoric of the poisoner served a dual purpose. It provided an outlet for the psychological trauma of the survivors, and simultaneously offered a legal justification for the seizure of Jewish property and the total cancellation of outstanding loans held by Christian debtors. Communal violence in the Hungarian borderlands often preceded official decrees, as the migration of the plague was accompanied by the rapid migration of rumors. In Pressburg and surrounding regions, the traditional legal status of Jews as servants of the royal chamber was disregarded by mobs who viewed the pandemic as an existential threat that required the immediate removal of corrupting influences. This populist radicalization was not merely an outburst of religious zeal, but a structural shift where the survival of the majority was predicated on the liquidation of a visible minority. By 1349, the Jewish population was no longer seen as a fiscal asset to be protected by the crown, but as a toxic element whose presence allegedly fueled the biological destruction of the kingdom. This cognitive shift from economic partner to biological threat was the final prerequisite for the royal edict of expulsion, as Louis I prepared to sacrifice the community to maintain his own standing as a protector of the Christian state. The dissemination of anti-Jewish rhetoric during the mid-14th century functioned as a sophisticated psychological mechanism that translated biological fear into a rigid theological framework of collective guilt. This period saw the proliferation of the host desecration myth, a narrative asserting that Jewish communities surreptitiously obtained the consecrated bread of the Eucharist to subject it to ritualized torture. In the context of the 1349 crisis, this specific accusation served to link the physical symptoms of the plague, specifically the hemorrhaging and blackening of the skin, to a perceived supernatural assault on the body of Christ. By framing the pandemic as a direct consequence of these alleged ritual outrages, urban agitators provided a moral imperative for communal violence, arguing that the biological survival of the Christian populace was contingent upon the physical elimination of those accused of spiritual contamination. Local mendicant preachers, particularly within the Dominican and Franciscan orders in Buda and Esztergom, intensified this climate of hostility by utilizing the concept of perfidia, or the inherent treachery of the faithless. In their Lenten sermons and public orations, these clerics argued that the Hungarian kingdom's historical policy of tolerance was a fundamental violation of the Christian knight ideal established by Louis I. They asserted that the plague was not a natural event but a flagellum Dei, a whip of God, specifically triggered by the presence of non-believers within a sacred Christian territory. This rhetoric transformed the Jewish community from a legally protected administrative class into a metaphysical pollutant, effectively stripping them of their human status and reclassifying them as agents of a cosmic enemy. The circulation of fabricated letters, allegedly discovered in Western European cities, played a critical role in the radicalization of the Hungarian burgher class. These documents purported to reveal a trans-European network of Jewish leaders who had coordinated the destruction of Christendom through various clandestine means. While the well-poisoning accusation was the primary vehicle for this fear, the rhetoric expanded to include the blood libel, the false claim that Christian children were being abducted for ritual purposes. In Hungary, these myths were adapted to local circumstances, with rumors circulating that the corrupted heir was a byproduct of hidden Jewish magical practices designed to destabilize the Angevin dynasty. This intellectual framework ensured that every new death from the infection was interpreted as a fresh piece of evidence in a vast, invisible conspiracy. Social isolation was further enforced through the aggressive application of sumptuary laws, which mandated that Jewish residents wear specific identifiers, such as the pointed hat or the yellow circle of cloth. While these markers had existed in legal theory since the Fourth Lateran Council, their systematic enforcement in 1349 served a tactical purpose. It allowed the panic-stricken populace to instantly identify and avoid the perceived sources of contagion. This visual marking of the enemy facilitated a state of hypervigilance where any Jewish individual found outside their designated quarter was treated as a potential carrier of both biological and spiritual death. The rhetoric of fear thus succeeded in compartmentalizing the urban space into zones of purity and pollution, creating a social environment where the previous century's cosmopolitan interactions were replaced by a militant and exclusionary communal identity. By the eve of the formal expulsion, the collective consciousness of the Hungarian free cities had been thoroughly saturated with these overlapping myths. The king's court found itself under immense pressure to validate these popular delusions as a means of restoring domestic order. The rhetoric of the era moved beyond mere religious disagreement, evolving into a proto-biological form of hatred that linked ethnicity, ritual, and disease into a single, lethal identity. This ideological superstructure provided the necessary legal and moral cover for the total seizure of assets that would follow as the Crown prepared to translate these fabricated outrages into a formal policy of state-sponsored removal. The rhetoric of fear thus acted as the final intellectual bridge between the biological reality of the Black Death and the administrative reality of the 1349 edict. By the early months of 1349, the administrative focus of the Hungarian court shifted from the management of the pandemic's biological impact to a desperate attempt at restoring the moral and social order of a fractured state. King Louis I, increasingly influenced by his Franciscan confessors and the ascetic movements that had gained traction during the plague, interpreted the continued high mortality rates as a clear manifestation of divine displeasure. His personal piety, which had always been characterized by a militant devotion to Catholic orthodoxy, was now channeled into a specific political objective: the systematic purification of the kingdom to secure spiritual reprieve. This theological perspective provided the king with a framework for understanding the total collapse of his kingdom's social systems, moving the responsibility for the disaster away from his own administration and onto the perceived religious infidelity within his realm. The intersection of this personal zeal with the pragmatic requirements of statecraft occurred as the Hungarian urban centers reached a point of total insurrection. The burgher councils, particularly in Buda and Pressburg, presented the crown with a set of demands that linked the restoration of public peace to the removal of the Jewish community. For Louis I, the expulsion offered a unique administrative release valve that could satisfy the growing demands of the frantic populace, while simultaneously aligning with his own ideological pursuit of a most Christian kingdom. The king recognized that by validating the populist accusations of the era, he could regain the support of the urban elites and the lower clergy, whose cooperation was essential for the post-plague reconstruction of the royal bureaucracy. Political necessity also dictated that the crown resolve the massive accumulation of debt that had paralyzed the domestic economy during the 1348 outbreak. Much of the agrarian and urban nobility was heavily indebted to Jewish creditors, and the social tension generated by these financial obligations threatened to erupt into a widespread feudal revolt. By decreeing the expulsion, Louis I provided himself with a legal mechanism to effectively liquidate these debts, thereby earning the loyalty of the landed classes who were struggling with the collapse of manorial revenues. This decision represented a fundamental shift in Angevin statecraft. The crown was no longer willing to defend the long-term fiscal benefits of Jewish-led commerce if it came at the cost of immediate political stability and the religious approval of the Church. The year 1349 marked the moment when Louis I's role as a Christian knight superseded his role as the protector of the servants of the chamber. The royal council, dominated by clerics who viewed the pandemic through an eschatological lens, argued that the king's primary duty was the salvation of his subjects' souls rather than the preservation of ancient charters. This consensus allowed the king to frame the expulsion not as an act of administrative failure, but as a proactive religious sacrifice intended to appease the divine and halt the great mortality. The decree was thus a calculated intersection of private belief and public management, where the total marginalization of a minority was utilized to rebuild the crumbling authority of the centralized state. This consolidation of power, achieved through the enforcement of religious uniformity, established the template for the final administrative action that would initiate the Great Exodus from the Hungarian borders. The formal deliberations that culminated in the Edict of 1349 took place within the judicial chambers of the royal palace in Buda, involving the Concilium Regium, a body composed of the kingdom's highest prelates, the Palatine, and the Master of the Treasury. This session represented a definitive break from the legal continuity established by the Arpadian and early Angevin monarchs, who had consistently prioritized the utilitas regis, or the royal utility, of the Jewish community over populist demands. The minutes of these proceedings, reflected in subsequent administrative actions, indicate that the council's primary objective was to resolve the total administrative paralysis caused by the second wave of the pandemic. Unlike the sporadic and localized violence of the previous year, the council sought a centralized, state-sanctioned solution that would provide the crown with a legal monopoly on the redistribution of Jewish wealth and property. A critical component of the debate centered on the revocation of the 1251 Charter, which had served as the constitutional basis for Jewish residency for nearly a century. The legal experts within the council argued that the servitudo camerae was a conditional privilege rather than a permanent right, and that the extraordinary circumstances of the plague provided the king with the judicial authority to terminate the contract without prior notice. The Master of the Treasury, who oversaw the Camera Regia, presented a comprehensive audit of the kingdom's financial state, revealing that the collapse of the mining sector and the disruption of customs collection necessitated an immediate infusion of capital. The council concluded that the total seizure of Jewish liquid assets and the appropriation of real estate in the royal free cities would provide the necessary funds to stabilize the royal court and pay the arrears of the mercenary garrisons stationed along the frontier. The administrative mechanism of the expulsion was meticulously drafted to ensure that the crown, rather than the urban mobs or the local nobility, remained the primary beneficiary of the community's removal. The edict specified that all outstanding debts owed to Jewish creditors were to be surrendered to the royal chamber. The king would then selectively cancel these debts for his political allies, while collecting a portion of the principal from others to fill the state coffers. This process, known as the cleansing of the books, was designed to dismantle the credit infrastructure of the kingdom and replace it with a state-directed financial system. The prelates within the council further insisted that the synagogues and communal buildings be confiscated and converted into Christian chapels or almshouses, a move intended to physically erase the Jewish presence from the urban topography of the kingdom. The final issuance of the decree was marked by the application of the royal sigillum authenticum, signifying the absolute and irreversible nature of the decision. This act transformed the 1,349 expulsion from a temporary response to the plague into a formal policy of the Hungarian state. The council established a strict timeline for the exodus, mandating that all Jewish families vacate the kingdom's territory by the following liturgical season, with any remaining individuals facing the total forfeiture of their lives to the royal judiciary. This legal framework effectively institutionalized the rhetoric of fear, providing a state-sanctioned outlet for the communal tensions that had been building since the first appearance of the pathogen. By the time the council adjourned, the Hungarian kingdom had officially transitioned from a pluralistic feudal society to a centralized confessional state, setting the stage for the logistical removal of a population that had been a pillar of the kingdom's economy for generations. The implementation of the 1349 edict necessitated the rapid mobilization of the royal administrative apparatus, transforming the treasury's clerks and the municipal guards into agents of systematic displacement. This logistical operation began with the deployment of royal commissioners, often referred to as exacting agents, who were dispatched to the major Jewish quarters of the kingdom to initiate a comprehensive census of all residents and their holdings. Unlike the chaotic pogroms seen in the Rhineland, the Hungarian removal was characterized by a meticulous bureaucratic process, designed to prevent the siphoning of assets by local mobs before they could be recorded by the crown. Scribes accompanied by armed detachments entered the Judenvikas of Buda and Esztergom, house by house, to compile detailed registers known as Inventoria Bonorum, which documented everything from structural real estate to the weight of bullion and the quality of textiles found within domestic spaces. The cataloging of financial instruments was the most technically demanding phase of the operation, requiring the seizure of all communal and private ledgers. These parchment records, containing the histories of loans, interest accruals, and collateral agreements, were transported to the royal chancellery under heavy guard. The master of the treasury established specialized audit rooms where clerks verified the authenticity of seals and cross-referenced debt obligations with the names of Christian noblemen and burghers. This administrative effort ensured that no financial obligation was lost in the transition, as the crown intended to assume the role of the primary creditor. The physical properties, including the vaulted stone houses and warehouses, were marked with the royal seal to signify their transition to state ownership, effectively barring the residents from accessing their own storerooms as the departure date approached. The organization of the physical exodus required the coordination of municipal gates and the establishment of transit corridors toward the western and northern frontiers. Royal decrees mandated that the Jewish families provide their own means of transport, leading to a desperate liquidation of non-essential items in the days preceding the deadline. Administrative checkpoints were erected at the primary city gates, such as the Saturday Gate in Buda, where departing groups were subjected to final inspections to ensure that no prohibited wealth, specifically uncoined silver or gold, was being smuggled out of the kingdom. These checkpoints functioned as the final site of state extraction, as officials levied exit fees and issued temporary safe conduct letters that were valid only until the individual crossed the Hungarian border. The timing of the removal was synchronized with the movements of the royal army to ensure that the roads remained clear of unauthorized blockades that might interfere with the state's control over the process. Logistical management extended to the religious infrastructure, where the keys to synagogues and ritual baths were formally handed over to local ecclesiastical authorities in the presence of a notary. This bureaucratic handover ensured that the transition from Jewish communal space to Christian institutional space was documented and legally binding under royal law. The sheer volume of data generated during this period, ranging from property deeds to the registers of the exiled, marked a significant advancement in the state's capacity for mass population management. By the time the final columns of families were directed toward the Danube or the Austrian passes, the administrative machinery had effectively stripped the community of its material existence, leaving behind only the meticulously maintained ledgers that now fueled the royal treasury. The removal was thus not merely a physical act of force, but a triumph of 14th century record-keeping, where the disappearance of a population was mirrored by the appearance of a vast new archive of state-controlled wealth. The completion of the administrative census triggered the immediate transition of Jewish-owned assets into the direct possession of the Hungarian royal fisc, a process referred to in contemporary Latin records as the confiscatio bonorum. This systematic liquidation was overseen by the master of the treasury and implemented through a network of local vice-palatines, royal castellanies. The crown's primary objective was the conversion of non-liquid real estate and commercial inventories into accessible capital to fund the kingdom's military and administrative overhead. In the primary urban centers of Buda, Sopron, and Pressburg, the physical transfer of property was finalized by the formal entry of royal officials into the abandoned Jewish quarters, where the vacant status of the buildings allowed for their immediate redistribution or public auction. The liquidation of urban real estate represented the largest structural transfer of wealth in the mid-14th century. The royal treasury utilized these properties as a form of political currency, granting many of the most valuable stone-built houses and merchant warehouses to loyal members of the lower nobility and the urban burgher elite who had supported the king's centralizing reforms. For properties not granted as rewards, the crown held public sales, requiring purchasers to pay an immediate introitus fee directly to the royal chamber. These transactions were meticulously recorded in the municipal land registers, effectively erasing Jewish titles and replacing them with Christian ownership. This process not only filled the state coffers, but also satisfied the territorial ambitions of the municipal councils, who sought to integrate the formerly autonomous Jewish districts into the standard city administration. Simultaneously, the crown enforced the total seizure of financial claims by assuming the legal identity of the primary creditor for the entire kingdom. The parchment ledgers seized during the earlier administrative phase were processed to identify all outstanding loans and interest obligations. Louis I issued specific directives to the royal collectors to pursue the collection of these debts from Christian noblemen and merchants, often demanding the immediate payment of a significant percentage of the principal in exchange for the cancellation of accumulated interest. This debt harvesting provided a massive influx of liquid silver and gold florins, which the crown utilized to pay the arrears of the border garrisons and to fund the diplomatic missions required to stabilize the post-plague geopolitical landscape. The liquidation of these debts effectively reset the Hungarian credit market, placing the crown at the center of all major financial transactions. The physical remains of communal life, specifically synagogues and ritual buildings, were subjected to a process of religious and architectural cleansing. In several instances, the Master of the Treasury authorized the demolition of these structures to provide building materials for royal fortifications or the construction of new Christian chapels. Where the buildings were architecturally significant, they were converted into secular administrative offices or donated to the mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans, as a reward for their role in promoting religious uniformity. This physical repurposing was essential for the state's objective of cultural erasure, ensuring that the visual landscape of the Hungarian cities reflected the new, strictly confessional identity of the Angevin monarchy. By removing the physical symbols of Jewish presence, the crown solidified its claim that the 1349 edict was a permanent and irreversible restoration of the kingdom's spiritual order. The final phase of the liquidation involved the bulk sale of commercial inventories, including sequestered stores of wine, grain, and imported textiles. These commodities were auctioned in the municipal marketplaces, with the proceeds funneled directly into the lucrum camera. The scale of this asset seizure was so vast that it allowed the Hungarian treasury to maintain its solvency despite the catastrophic loss of traditional tax revenue caused by the Black Death. The forfeiture of assets thus served as a vital fiscal bridge, enabling the Angevin state to survive the environmental and economic collapse of the late 1340s. By the time the liquidation was complete, the material existence of the Jewish community in Hungary had been entirely absorbed into the state's financial architecture, leaving the royal treasury more robust and more centralized than it had been at the start of the pandemic. The final Sabbath observed by the Jewish community in the autumn of 1349 marked the functional conclusion of a sedentary history that, for many families in the Danubian basin, spanned over 3 centuries. This temporal boundary was defined by the intersection of the rigid astronomical calculations of rabbinic law and the administrative deadline imposed by the royal court in Buda. As the sun reached the required degree below the horizon to initiate the day of rest, the internal life of the Jewish quarters in Sopron, Pressburg, and the capital transitioned into a state of ritualized suspension. Despite the imminent logistical requirements of the Sunday morning departure, the community was legally and religiously bound to cease all labor, including the packing of goods and the finalization of travel arrangements, creating a period of forced stillness under the oversight of municipal guards. The liturgical proceedings within the Gothic synagogues during these final 24 hours were characterized by specific modifications to the traditional service, reflecting the community's transition from a settled administrative class to a refugee population. Historical evidence suggests that the Tefillat Haderech, or the Traveler's Prayer, was integrated into the communal liturgy with unprecedented frequency, serving as a formal recognition of the physical dangers inherent in the upcoming crossing of the Austrian and Bohemian frontiers. The most significant ritual act involved the removal of the Sefer Torah scrolls from the stone-carved arks. These scrolls, some of which had been commissioned during the stable era of the Arpad dynasty, were prepared for transport using specialized leather casings designed to protect the parchment from the environmental rigors of the road. The demographic composition of the communal gatherings highlighted the multi-generational nature of the expulsion. Census data from the preceding royal audit indicated that a significant portion of the population consisted of the elderly and young children, groups for whom the halakhic exemptions regarding travel during the Sabbath were scrutinized by communal leaders. The religious authorities within the Judenvikas were tasked with providing final rulings on the Pikuach Nefesh principle, the preservation of life, which permitted certain violations of the Sabbath rest if they were deemed essential for the survival of the community during the initial phase of the Exodus. This included the secure attachment of royal safe conduct letters to the persons of the household heads, ensuring these documents were immediately accessible at the Sunday morning inspections. The physical atmosphere within the quarters was defined by the absence of the commercial activity that had integrated these districts into the Hungarian economy for generations. The marketplaces and exchange stalls, now formally sequestered by the Sigillum Regium, remained vacant as the residents focused on the internal rituals of the Havdalah, the ceremony marking the end of the Sabbath and the beginning of the new week. This ritual involves the extinguishing of a multi-wicked candle in wine, an act that, in the context of 1349, signaled the permanent cessation of the community's legal residency. The Ner Tamid, or the Eternal Flame, which had burned in the Buddha synagogue since its consecration following the 1251 charter, was formally extinguished by the communal elders, a symbolic recognition that the building had transitioned from a sacred space to a forfeited royal asset. By the final hours of Saturday evening, the administrative reality of the 1349 edict exerted total control over the urban space. The municipal authorities enforced a strict curfew, ensuring that no Jewish resident left the quarter before the official opening of the city gates at dawn. The community remained in a state of prepared isolation, separated from their Christian neighbors by the very walls that had once offered royal protection. The silence of these final hours was not merely a result of religious observance, but a consequence of the total stripping of the community's social and economic roles. As the deadline approached, the Jewish population of Hungary existed in a state of legal nonentity, waiting for the first light of Sunday to initiate the physical removal that would erase their presence from the kingdom's demographic record. The physical execution of the 1349 edict commenced at the first canonical hour of Sunday morning, coinciding with the official opening of the municipal fortifications across the Hungarian royal free cities. In Buda, the concentration of the departing population was centered at the Saturday Gate and the Jewish Gate, where the narrow streets of the former quarter funneled thousands of individuals into organized columns. The departure was governed by the Ordo Agressionis, a set of administrative rules that dictated the sequence of the march to prevent a total collapse of the city's perimeter security. Families were organized according to their primary mode of transport, with the few remaining horse-drawn wagons positioned at the front of each contingent, followed by the larger group of pedestrians, and those utilizing manual handcarts. This spatial arrangement was strictly enforced by the municipal militia and royal guards, who maintained a cordon between the exiles and the Christian burghers gathered to witness the transition. The visual profile of the Exodus was defined by the severe limitations placed on mobile property, which mandated that only the most essential items for survival and religious practice could be transported. The resulting columns were characterized by a high density of specialized containers, including wooden chests and leather sacks, which were frequently overloaded and required the collaborative effort of multiple family members to move. The soundscape of the departure was dominated by the mechanical strain of 14th-century transport. The heavy creaking of ungreased wooden axles, the rhythmic strike of iron-rimmed wheels against the uneven limestone cobbles of the castle hill, and the low-frequency murmur of a population moving under duress. These sounds signaled the final severance of the community from the urban environment they had helped construct, as the paved thoroughfares of the royal seats gave way to the unpaved, rutted tracks of the suburban districts. As the columns moved beyond the immediate protection of the city walls, they entered the Territorium Civitatis, the rural outskirts governed by the town's jurisdiction. Here, the royal guards transitioned from a role of surveillance to one of an armed escort, tasked with guiding the population along the designated transit corridors. The primary route for those departing from the northern and western cities followed the Danube's southern bank, a path that was strategically chosen to facilitate the monitoring of the group's progress from the river. The visual continuity of the column stretched for several miles, a thin line of movement that contrasted sharply with the static, plague-thinned landscape of the Hungarian countryside. The logistics of the march required frequent pauses to address the mechanical failure of carts or the exhaustion of the elderly, yet these stops were strictly regulated by the heralds to ensure the frontier was reached before the onset of the early autumn frosts. The transition across the limes, or the internal administrative boundaries of the Hungarian counties, marked the final stage of the exodus. At each boundary, the royal safe conduct letters were inspected by the local coms, or their representatives, to verify that the group had not deviated from the mandated path. This movement represented a massive demographic shift from the centralized urban hubs to the peripheral borderlands, where the infrastructure for supporting such a large influx of people was non-existent. The sensory experience of this migration was one of increasing exposure. The controlled environment of the walled city was replaced by the environmental vulnerability of the open road, where the threat of the plague remained a constant biological background. By the time the lead elements of the column reached the first transit camps near the Austrian border, the community had been functionally transformed from a sedentary urban elite into a mobile, disenfranchised collective, existing in a state of legal and physical limbo between the kingdom they had left and the uncertain territories that lay ahead. The transition from the Danubian basin to the Transcarpathian frontier required the navigation of the Little Carpathian mountain range, a geographical barrier that fundamentally altered the logistical profile of the 1,349 migration. As the columns moved away from the royal centers of power, the administrative grip of the Angevin crown weakened, replaced by the decentralized and often hostile authority of local castellans and minor landowning nobility. The primary northern route utilized the Jablonica Pass and the White Mountain Crossing, which served as narrow bottlenecks, where the efficiency of the exodus was frequently compromised by the extraction of unauthorized transit dues. While the royal safe conduct letters, or salvus conductus, theoretically exempted the refugees from internal tolls, local feudal lords often asserted their customary rights to tax any movement through their private domains. These extortions were justified by the lords as necessary compensation for the perceived spiritual contamination of their lands, or as fees for the use of maintained bridges and mountain tracks, effectively functioning as a secondary liquidation of the community's remaining mobile assets. The physical vulnerability of the refugee columns was exacerbated by the steep gradients and unpaved conditions of the 14th century mountain roads. The heavy, iron-rimmed wagons that had successfully traversed the flat Danubian plains frequently suffered mechanical failure on the loose shale and limestone inclines of the passes. The breakage of a single axle in a narrow defile could result in the total paralysis of the column for several hours, creating stationary targets for the irregular militias and outlaws that inhabited the borderlands. This period saw a significant rise in banditry, fueled by the desertion of soldiers from plague-stricken garrisons and the displacement of the rural peasantry. These free companies operated beyond the reach of the royal judiciary, utilizing the dense forest cover of the Carpathian foothills to launch rapid assaults on the rear of the columns, where the most vulnerable and least protected families were positioned. Rural security was further undermined by the right of spoils, jus naufragii, a legal tradition that some local nobles attempted to apply to the property of the exiles. Under this interpretation, any cart that broke down or was abandoned on noble land became the immediate property of the local lord. This created a perverse incentive for officials at the mountain checkpoints to delay the columns through redundant inspections of the safe conduct papers, hoping that the onset of nightfall or inclement weather would force the migrants to abandon their heavier equipment. The absence of royal peace officers in these remote districts meant that there was no neutral arbitrator to enforce the king's original decree of safe passage. Consequently, the journey through the passes was defined by constant negotiation and the bribery of local officials to ensure the movement of the group. The biological threat of the plague remained integrated into these logistical hardships, as the high density of people and livestock in the narrow passes facilitated new cycles of infection. The lack of standardized sanitation in the temporary roadside camps, combined with the exhaustion induced by the high-altitude march, resulted in a high mortality rate that contemporary registers in the neighboring Austrian and Moravian territories began to document. Bodies of those who succumbed during the ascent were frequently left in unmarked pits along the roadside, as the pace of the removal permitted no ritual burial. By the time the lead elements of the 1,349 exodus reached the summits of the western passes, the community had been subjected to a process of physical and economic attrition that far exceeded the formal extraction of the royal treasury in Buda. This phase of the migration established the Carpathian borderlands as a site of extreme disenfranchisement, where the theoretical protection of the medieval state was proven to be geographically limited and legally unenforceable. The demographic impact of the 1,349 migration was most severely manifested in the rapid attrition of the elderly and the infirm, a segment of the population that served as the primary repository for the community's oral traditions and rabbinic expertise. In the 14th century, the Jewish communities of the Carpathian Basin were characterized by a high degree of generational integration, where the household unit often included 3 generations living within the same urban lot. The forced transition from a sedentary domestic life to the rigorous physical demands of a cross-border march placed an unsustainable physiological burden on individuals whose health was already compromised by age or the residual effects of the recurring plague cycles. Medical history suggests that the caloric requirements of a high-altitude march, combined with the extreme temperature fluctuations of the late autumn, induced a state of metabolic exhaustion that the elderly were biologically ill-equipped to survive. The loss of this demographic segment resulted in a profound cultural decapitation of the community. Within the medieval Jewish structure, the elders were not merely family members but the official witnesses to the ketubot, or marriage contracts, and the primary authorities on the minhagim, the local customs that differentiated the Hungarian Jewish identity from that other Ashkenazi groups. As these individuals succumbed to exposure and cardiac failure along the mountain passes, the group's legal and historical continuity was severed. Contemporary burial registers from the border towns of the Holy Roman Empire indicate a disproportionate number of deaths among those aged 50 and older during this period, reflecting a survival of the fittest dynamic that effectively eliminated the learned class. The absence of traditional medicinal resources, specifically the herbal apothecaries, and specialized care systems found in the urban quarters of Buda, meant that even minor respiratory infections or physical injuries became fatal during the transit. Furthermore, the mortality of the elderly during the 1349 exodus was exacerbated by the lack of traditional mourning periods, or Shiva, which were suspended due to the administrative deadlines imposed by the royal guards. The inability to observe these rituals forced the community into a state of perpetual psychological trauma, as the dead were often interred in shallow, unmarked graves provided by local villagers at exorbitant costs. This disruption of the funerary cycle was seen by contemporary chroniclers as the final stage of the community's disenfranchisement. They were losing not only their physical property, but their ancestral lineage. The demographic toll also extended to nursing infants and the chronically ill, who lacked the robust immune systems necessary to withstand the contaminated water sources and irregular food supply of the rural road. By the time the columns reached the designated frontier points, the internal hierarchy of the Jewish community had been fundamentally altered. The surviving population was disproportionately comprised of young and middle-aged adults, individuals who possessed the physical stamina to survive the march, but who lacked the deep liturgical and legal knowledge of the deceased elders. This demographic shift created a generational vacuum that would hinder the reconstruction of communal institutions in the subsequent decades. The loss of the elders thus represented a permanent depletion of the community's intellectual capital, marking the end of a specific cultural era in Hungarian Jewish history. The physical survival of the younger generation was achieved at the cost of the communal memory, leaving the exiles to enter their new territories as a fragmented and culturally impoverished body, stripped of the biological and spiritual anchors that had sustained them for centuries. The arrival of the Hungarian Jewish exiles at the external frontiers of the kingdom in late 1349 created an immediate administrative and humanitarian crisis for the neighboring principalities of the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Poland. As the columns reached the banks of the March and Lethe rivers, which demarcated the border with the Archduchy of Austria and the Margraviate of Moravia, they encountered a complex network of military blockades and makeshift quarantine stations. The authorities in these territories, having witnessed the devastation of the pandemic in their own urban centers, viewed the sudden influx of thousands of displaced persons not merely as a demographic event, but as a primary biological threat. Consequently, the first interaction between the exiles and their potential hosts was characterized by a policy of cordon sanitaire, where the refugees were confined to swampy riverbanks and neutral zones for periods of several weeks to ensure they bore no active symptoms of the plague. In the Archduchy of Austria, the response was dictated by Duke Albrecht II, known as the Wise, whose approach to the refugee crisis was significantly more pragmatic than that of Louis I. Recognizing the potential for a massive influx of specialized commercial talent and liquid capital, Albrecht II maintained a policy of relative tolerance, even in the face of intense pressure from the Viennese burgher councils, to mirror the Hungarian expulsion. The Austrian administration required the exiles to undergo a rigorous legal vetting process, where individuals were forced to swear a specialized oath, a variation of the Judenite affirming their lack of criminal history and their willingness to adhere to local fiscal regulations. This selective entry meant that while the wealthier merchant families were granted residency in the suburban districts of Vienna and Wiener Neustadt, the destitute and the infirm were often denied passage, remaining trapped in the no man's land between the two jurisdictions. To the north, the Kingdom of Poland under Casimir III, or Casimir the Great, emerged as a primary destination for the Hungarian diaspora. Casimir's administration sought to utilize the Jewish influx to accelerate the urbanization of the Polish interior, specifically in the regions surrounding Krakow and Sandomierz. By confirming and expanding the Statute of Kalisz, the Polish crown offered a level of legal autonomy and physical protection that was increasingly rare in Central Europe. This proactive recruitment of the Hungarian exiles was intended to bypass the traditional German-dominated merchant guilds that controlled Polish trade. The integration of these refugees was managed through the establishment of new Jewish streets or oppidums, where the crown provided land for the construction of residences in exchange for the immediate resumption of international trade operations and the management of royal salt and lead mines. However, the uncertain sanctuary of these territories was underscored by the continued volatility of the populist flagellant movements, which frequently crossed borders to incite local mobs against the new arrivals. Even in cities where the sovereign offered protection, the municipal councils often imposed restrictive quota systems and exorbitant entry taxes that depleted the refugees' remaining resources. In the Moravian towns of Brno and Olomouc, the arrival of the exiles was met with legal challenges regarding their right to hold property or participate in the local wine markets, leading to prolonged litigation in the imperial courts. The survivors of the 1,349 exodus thus found themselves in a state of permanent precariousness, where their residency was a revocable privilege dependent on the fluctuating economic interests of the local nobility. By the end of the year, the Hungarian Jewish community had been transformed into a fragmented diaspora, scattered across the Central European landscape and forced to negotiate their survival in a world where the plague had fundamentally altered the value of human life and the reliability of royal law. The preservation of identity among the 1,349 exiles was facilitated through the systematic adoption of onomastic markers that established their geographical origin within the administrative records of their host territories. In the tax registers and municipal Schreinsbücher of Austrian and German cities, individuals, formerly of the Hungarian royal seats, began to appear with the descriptive surnames Ungar, Hungarus, or Hager, a vernacular derivation of Magyar. This naming convention served as a critical tool for lineage tracking, allowing families to maintain a distinct social identity within the broader Ashkenazi diaspora. By institutionalizing their origin in the legal documents of their new residences, the community ensured that their connection to the Hungarian crown remained a matter of public record even after the physical revocation of their residency rights. The retention of the Minhag Hungaria, or the specific Hungarian liturgical rite, functioned as the primary vehicle for cultural continuity in the absence of a territorial base. This ritual framework included unique melodies for the piyutim and specific variations in the order of prayer that had developed in the synagogues of Buda and Esztergom during the Arpadian era. In the refugee congregations established in Krakow and Vienna, the Hungarian exiles frequently formed their own Hevra Kadisha, or burial societies, which adhered strictly to the funerary customs of their homeland. These micro-institutions allowed the 1,349 generation to resist total assimilation into the local Jewish populations, preserving the linguistic nuances of the Judeo-Hungarian dialect and the specific rabbinic interpretations that had characterized the Hakmei Hungaria, or the sages of Hungary. Documentary preservation played a vital role in maintaining the social and legal hierarchy of the displaced community. Despite the wide-scale forfeiture of real estate, many families successfully transported their ketubat, marriage contracts, and gittin divorce records, which served as essential proof of lineage and marital status under Jewish law. These parchments, often bearing the signatures of the now-deceased elders of the Buda community, were utilized in the new rabbinic courts of Poland and Moravia to establish the yikus, or ancestral prestige, of the refugees. Furthermore, some merchant families preserved private ledgers and copies of royal safe conducts, which they used as templates to negotiate new commercial privileges with neighboring sovereigns. This archival continuity allowed for the reconstruction of family trees and the maintenance of internal social standing, ensuring that the elite status held in Hungary was recognized by the new host authorities. The intellectual legacy of the 1,349 generation was codified through the continued study of the Hungarian Responsa, a body of legal decisions that addressed the specific economic and social conditions of life, the Angevin dynasty. The surviving scholars from the Hungarian yeshivo integrated these traditions into the academic centers of the Holy Roman Empire, where the Hungarian style of rabbinic analysis became a recognized school of thought. This transfer of knowledge ensured that the unique synthesis of Sephardic and Ashkenazi influences that had flourished in medieval Hungary was not erased by the physical displacement of its practitioners. By the close of the 14th century, the memory of the land had been transformed into a portable text-based identity, where the Kingdom of Hungary existed as a liturgical and legal concept within the global Jewish consciousness. The departure of the Jewish population in the autumn of 1349 resulted in an immediate and profound topographic shift within the primary urban centers of the Hungarian kingdom. In the capital of Buda, the Jewish street, on the western side of the Castle Hill, once a high-density zone of commercial and ritual activity, transitioned into a state of physical vacancy that lasted for several months. Archaeological evidence from this period indicates a sudden cessation of domestic maintenance. Hearths were left cold, and the vaulted cellars, previously the secure repositories for the kingdom's liquid wealth, stood empty and unmonitored. This physical silence was not merely a lack of residence, but a total suspension of the economic functions that had integrated these districts into the life of the royal seat. The municipal authorities of Buda utilized this period of vacancy to conduct a final assessment of the structural integrity of the stone houses, preparing them for an unprecedented redistribution of urban real estate. The repurposing of these empty quarters was managed through a series of royal grants issued by Louis I, who utilized the vacated properties as a form of political patronage to reward his loyal Christian entourage. By early 1350, the royal chancellery began issuing deeds that transferred ownership of the stone residences in the former Judenvikas to high-ranking court officials, military commanders, and members of the lower nobility. In many cases, multiple smaller Jewish dwellings were merged into larger aristocratic curia or manor houses, effectively erasing the medieval urban grain of the quarter. This administrative redistribution was designed to Christianize the hilltop topography, ensuring that the most strategic locations near the royal palace were occupied by individuals bound to the king through land tenure. The former Saturday Gate area, once the focal point of Jewish trade, was systematically cleared of its commercial stalls and repurposed for the housing of the royal household's administrative staff. In Sopron, the municipal council took a more direct role in the integration of the abandoned Jewish street into the general city grid. The physical barriers that had historically demarcated the Jewish district, such as specific gates or dividing walls, were dismantled to signify the total unification of the urban space under Christian municipal law. Historical land registers from the 1352 show that the empty houses were frequently allocated to the burgeoning German burgher class, who sought to expand their textile and wine storage facilities. The rapid occupation of these spaces by Christian neighbors led to a period of architectural modification, where ritual features, like the mezuzah slots on doorposts, were removed or plastered over to align with the new owner's religious identity. This physical erasure was a critical component of the remnants of the city, turning the memory of the former residents into a silent archaeological layer. The most significant structural transformation occurred within the communal and religious buildings of the districts. The Great Synagogue of Buda, a masterpiece of early Gothic architecture, was stripped of its liturgical furnishings and converted into a secular warehouse, or, in some instances, a chapel dedicated to Christian saints. The ritual baths, or mikvaot, were often filled in or converted into standard storage cellars, as their original function was deemed obsolete under the new social order. This process of sacred repurposing served to validate the 1349 expulsion as a permanent victory for the confessional state, physically demonstrating that the space had been reclaimed for the faith of the monarch. The bells of the neighboring Christian parish churches, which had previously vied with the quiet rhythms of the Jewish quarter, now dominated the soundscape of the entire hilltop. By the time the initial reconstruction of the quarters was complete, the material record of Jewish life had been largely obscured. Modern archaeological excavations in the castle district of Buda have uncovered hidden hoards of silver coins and jewelry buried beneath the floors of these houses, material evidence of a population that intended to return, whose properties were rapidly claimed by their neighbors. The empty quarters thus became a site of rapid urban evolution, where the disappearance of one community provided the physical foundation for the expansion of the Christian elite. The silence of 1349 was replaced by the noise of new construction and the administrative bustle of a city that had been fundamentally reorganized to exclude its former architects. The immediate consequence of the 1349 edict was a systemic paralysis of the Hungarian credit market, as the expulsion of the Jewish community removed the primary source of operational capital for both the landed nobility and the urban merchant class. While the royal treasury had successfully harvested existing debts and liquidated physical assets, the administrative state failed to provide a replacement mechanism for the issuance of new credit. This created a structural liquidity crisis. The servientes regis and the higher aristocracy, who relied on seasonal bridging loans to fund the labor and equipment required for the manorial harvest, found themselves with significant agricultural assets but no access to the cash required for their maintenance. The resulting contraction of the money supply led to an immediate decline in the velocity of circulation, as currency was hoarded by the crown or tied up in the lengthy legal processes associated with the redistribution of forfeited estates. International trade networks were effectively severed, as the specialized Jewish brokerage houses that linked the Carpathian Basin to the markets of the Holy Roman Empire and the Mediterranean were dismantled. These networks had been built on centuries of familial trust and shared liturgical law, allowing for the movement of high-value goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals through the use of sutaha, or primitive bills of exchange. Without these intermediaries, the Hungarian kingdom lost its primary connection to the commercial hubs of Venice and the Rhineland. The burgeoning Christian burgher class, although eager to claim the physical marketplaces, lacked the established international credit lines and the linguistic expertise necessary to manage the logistics of long-distance wholesale trade. Consequently, the volume of exports, particularly in the vital grain and wine sectors, dropped precipitously, leading to a significant shortfall in the tricasima customs revenue collected at the border stations. The collapse of the wholesale export market had a secondary impact on the domestic price of commodities, as surplus wine from the Sopron and northern vineyards could no longer be efficiently transported to the Polish or German markets. The local markets became oversaturated, leading to a deflationary spiral in agricultural prices. This price collapse further eroded the financial stability of the nobility, who were already struggling with the demographic loss of the peasantry to the plague, the royal salt monopoly, and the minting operations in the mining towns also suffered from a lack of technical oversight and capital investment, as the Jewish Kammerai who had managed these complex fiscal units were no longer present to oversee the refined bookkeeping required for such high turnover operations. The state's fiscal architecture, once a model of Angevin efficiency, began to revert to a more primitive, barter-based system in many rural districts. Urban centers experienced a period of commercial stagnation characterized by the decline of the Forum as a site of international exchange. The municipal councils in Buda and Esztergom reported a sharp decrease in the collection of market tolls and stall fees, as the diversified trade goods that once defined the cosmopolitan life of the cities were replaced by localized, low-value agricultural products. The economic vacuum was particularly visible in the cessation of luxury construction and the artisanal trades that had previously flourished under the patronage of the Jewish financial elite. This period of stagnation was not merely a temporary interruption caused by the pandemic, but a fundamental regression in the kingdom's economic development. The removal of the Jewish community had achieved the political goal of religious uniformity at the cost of the kingdom's integration into the burgeoning European capitalist system. By the early 1352s, the Hungarian economy was defined by its increasing isolation and the erosion of its centralized financial institutions. The royal chamber found that while the initial confiscations had provided a massive windfall, the long-term tax base was severely depleted by the destruction of the credit-driven trade networks. The servants of the royal chamber had functioned as the economic nervous system of the state, and their absence left the crown without the means to effectively stimulate growth in the post-plague environment. This economic stagnation served as a silent but persistent legacy of the 1349 edict, proving that the removal of a specialized administrative class had repercussions that far outlasted the biological threat of the Black Death. The kingdom entered the second half of the 14th century with a more rigid social structure, but a significantly more fragile and less innovative economy. By the early months of 1350, the initial religious euphoria that had accompanied the 1349 decree began to collide with the administrative realities of a kingdom experiencing a total cessation of capital movement. King Louis I, operating from his court at Visegrad, received formal commendations from the high clergy and the mendicant orders, who lauded the expulsion as a definitive fulfillment of the Rex Christianissimus ideal. From the perspective of the Roman Curia in Avignon, Louis's actions were framed as a necessary purgation of the great mortality's perceived spiritual causes, enhancing the king's diplomatic standing within the broader framework of the European Catholic hierarchy. This ecclesiastical approval provided the king with significant leverage in his ongoing negotiations regarding the Neapolitan succession and the stabilization of the Balkan frontiers, as it solidified his reputation as the primary defender of the faith in Central Europe. However, The internal reports from the Office of the Treasury presented a starkly different portrait of the kingdom's status. The Master of the Treasury provided the Royal Council with data indicating that the lucrum camera and the tricesima customs revenues had failed to recover to even 50% of their pre-1348 levels. While the Crown had successfully confiscated physical bullion and real estate, these assets were inherently static and could not replicate the dynamic credit systems that had previously funded the royal bureaucracy's daily operations. Louis I, to recognize that the elimination of the Jewish financial class had inadvertently dismantled the kingdom's only mechanism for rapid capital mobilization. The king's political calculation now faced a critical tension. The moral capital gained through religious uniformity was directly undermining the fiscal capital required to sustain a centralized Angevin state. The king's personal reflections, as evidenced by his subsequent legislative adjustments, indicated a growing awareness that the Christian knight ideology was structurally incompatible with the requirements of a high-volume commodity economy. The royal court found itself increasingly dependent on Italian banking houses and the burgeoning German burgher elite, yet these groups demanded higher interest rates and greater municipal autonomy than the crown's former servants of the chamber. Louis observed that while the expulsion had pacified the urban mobs and satisfied the debtor nobility, it had also created a power vacuum where the burgher councils could now challenge royal economic prerogatives with unprecedented confidence. The king began to view the 1349 edict not as a final solution, but as a high-risk political gamble that had secured his spiritual legitimacy at the expense of his operational independence. As the second wave of the pandemic finally ebbed, the administrative focus shifted toward the reconstruction of the fisc. Louis I engaged in a series of secretive deliberations with his closest secular advisors to determine if the kingdom could maintain its international commercial standing without the specialized brokerage networks of the diaspora. These calculations led to a more pragmatic interpretation of the 1349 decree, where the king began to issue individual exemptions for certain essential financial agents, signaling a quiet retreat from the absolute nature of the original expulsion. This period of reflection established a precedent for the conditional residency policies of the later 14th century, as the crown sought to balance the non-negotiable demands of the church with the survival of the Hungarian state's economic architecture. By 1351, the king's primary political objective was no longer the physical removal of an internal enemy, but the mitigation of the fiscal void that their absence had created. The 1349 edict established a definitive end to the period of unconditional royal protection that had characterized the first 3 centuries of Hungarian statehood, functioning as a legal watershed that permanently altered the nature of the servitudo camerae. This event transformed the status of the Jewish community from a foundational pillar of the royal administrative state into a strictly utilitarian and temporary residency group. While the Angevin monarchs eventually recognized that the economic stagnation of the 1352 necessitated a strategic reversal, the subsequent readmission of Jewish families in 1364 was not a restoration of the 1251 Charter's pluralistic spirit. Instead, the new order was defined by a residency for hire model, where the right to live within the kingdom was granted through short-term, revocable contracts tied to significantly higher tax obligations and more restrictive civil liberties. This shift reflected a new sovereign reality. The crown had discovered that it could prioritize ideological uniformity during periods of crisis and only resort to pragmatic pluralism when the state's fiscal survival was at stake. The long-term repercussions of 1349 also signaled the permanent triumph of the municipal burgher class over the centralized royal monopolies that had historically shielded the Jewish community from urban competition. City councils in the royal free cities utilized the precedent of the expulsion to assert jurisdictional control over their internal credit and retail markets, effectively integrating the formerly autonomous Jewish districts into the standard municipal grid. This structural change meant that any Jewish residents who returned in the later 14th century operated within a social hierarchy that viewed them as external commercial agents, rather than integral members of the urban fabric. The administrative machinery developed to manage the 1,349 removal, the systematic census-taking, the auditing of private ledgers, and the organization of forced transit remained a permanent part of the state's bureaucratic repertoire, creating a lingering threat of redeployment that influenced all future negotiations between the community and the crown. On a broader European scale, the echoes of 1,349 positioned the Hungarian kingdom as an active participant in the wider trend toward the creation of religiously homogeneous confessional states. The event effectively dismantled the cosmopolitan synthesis that had defined the early 14th century, replacing it with a more rigid, exclusionary identity that left no room for the high-level administrative roles previously held by non-Christian experts. The physical landscape of Hungarian cities remained a silent witness to this shift, as the repurposed synagogues and merged estates in the former Jewish quarters served as material evidence of the state's capacity for cultural erasure. Even when the Jewish community rebuilt their institutions in the 1362s, these new structures were often situated in less prominent urban zones, reflecting a marginalized status that stood in stark contrast to the hilltop prominence they had enjoyed under the early Angevins. The most enduring legacy of the expulsion was the introduction of a pervasive sense of legal insecurity into the Jewish consciousness within the Carpathian Basin. The realization that royal protection was not an institutional right but a personal whim of the monarch became a foundational element of the community's relationship with the Hungarian state for the remainder of the medieval period. This power dynamic ensured that while the Jewish population would return to play a role in the kingdom's late-century recovery, they would never again regain the status of protected architects of the royal treasury. The 1349 edict thus served as the closing of a door to the pluralistic experiments of the Middle Ages, leaving a historical record defined by the triumph of state-sanctioned uniformity over the pragmatic diversity that had once been the hallmark of the Hungarian crown's success. The closing decades of the 14th century in the Hungarian kingdom were defined by a profound structural transition as the centralized Angevin administration gave way to the volatile dynastic politics of the House of Luxembourg. Following the death of Louis I in 1382 and the subsequent coronation of Sigismund of Luxembourg, the legal relationship between the crown and its subjects was further complicated by the emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a permanent existential threat on the southern Danubian frontier. This new geopolitical reality forced a total reorganization of the kingdom's defensive infrastructure, requiring massive capital investments that the depleted post-1349 economy struggled to sustain. The military disaster at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396 served as a catalyst for a second wave of institutional hardening, where the state sought to compensate for external insecurity through the intensification of internal control and the formalization of social hierarchies. In this period, the legal status of the Jewish community, though partially restored through the 1364 readmission, remained structurally precarious and was subject to the increasing authority of the tavernical court. The master of the treasury now presided over a system where Jewish financial activity was strictly confined to high-interest, short-term lending, effectively barring them from the wholesale commodity markets they had once dominated. This era saw the codification of the Zsidóeszköt, or the judicial Jew oath, as a mandatory and highly ritualized component of the Hungarian legal system, ensuring that any litigation involving the community was conducted under a framework of inherent suspicion. The municipal councils of the royal free cities utilized this institutionalized distrust to further cement their jurisdictional autonomy, creating a landscape where the Jewish population existed in a state of permanent legal extraterritoriality. The intellectual environment of the late 1300s was characterized by a move away from the flexible feudal arrangements of the Arpadian era toward a more rigid definition of the Natio Hungarica. The Hungarian nobility, now organized into powerful leagues, increasingly viewed the presence of non-Christian financial experts as a violation of the kingdom's territorial integrity. This sentiment was reflected in the increasing frequency of moratorium decrees, which the Diet utilized to arbitrarily suspend the collection of interest on debts owed to Jewish creditors. The state's fiscal policy had effectively transitioned from the management of growth to the management of scarcity, where the crown's survival depended on the tactical exploitation of the few remaining minority resources. As the 14th century drew to a close, the cosmopolitan synthesis of the previous era was replaced by a localized, defensive communalism. The archaeological record from this period shows a significant reduction in the quality of Jewish domestic architecture, as the community shifted toward less durable materials in anticipation of future displacement. The memory of 1349 functioned as a permanent psychological barrier, preventing the long-term investment in urban infrastructure that had characterized the earlier Angevin years. This era of twilight was not merely a transition between dynasties, but a fundamental realization that the medieval experiment in pluralistic statecraft had been permanently superseded by the demands of the confessional state. The kingdom entered the 15th century as a bastion of European Christendom, but it did so with a fragmented social order and a profound awareness of the fragility of the civilization it sought to defend.